My name is Jeff Linwood, and I'm an iPhone app developer who also loves to teach people how to make iPhone apps. Today we are actually going to create our very first iPhone app. Whether you've had a lot of experience with programming before or whether you've never worked with iPhone apps at all. This should be a really easy process for everyone to follow along with. We take a user interface based approach. So we are going to start with the user interface that we want to have for our iPhone apps, and then we're going to learn how to make all of the connections work between them. So, getting started. The first thing you'll need to do is you'll need the XCode software. The latest version of this is version 8.2. It will run on any recent Mac. If you have questions about whether or not your Mac will run XCode, simply look for it in the App Store that's built into your Mac. Download XCode. It is free. It is a rather large download, so several gigabytes, something you'll probably want to do over a pretty strong Wi-Fi connection. But XCode itself is free. You can build your apps for free. You can develop all the iPhone apps and iPod apps that you want for free. You can even run them on your phone for free. You will have to pay Apple money as part of the Apple Developer Program if you would like to publish your app on the App Store. So it's great. You can actually do all of the work of development, testing on your own phone, maybe even on some of your friends' phones if you plug them into your own Mac. And then if you decide that your app is really good enough to publish it to the App Store, simply pay Apple their monthly or annual fee, and you can have access to the App Store yourself. And once you pay that one yearly fee, you can publish as many apps as you want to the App Store. So if we start Xcode, you'll see a screen that's similar to this, and this is the Welcome to Xcode screen. We have a couple different options here. We can get started with a playground, which is a great way to explore programming with Swift. Now, what is Swift? Swift is Apple's programming language for iPhone apps. Previously, Apple's had a programming language called Objective-C, which came from the company called Next Computer that Steve Jobs started after he left Apple. They created a computer called the Next Computer that ran a version of an operating system called Next Step, and the programming language used for that was called Objective-C. When Apple bought Next and brought Steve Jobs back in, that software became the foundation for modern Mac OS and the iOS operating system on the iPhone and iPad. And that worked really, really well. However, Apple took the advantage of the fact that they have some very smart people working there and built their own software programming language called Swift that has many advantages over Objective-C, and especially for beginners. So if you were going to pick up iPhone app development now for the first time, you'll want to use this programming language called Swift. There are a couple different versions of Swift, and you may see different references to Swift tutorials on the internet that may be a little bit out of date. Apple has been switching around how the Swift language looks from version to version. It's currently on version 3. So you may find some older Swift tutorials out there from 2015 that aren't going to work with this version of Xcode, and that's okay. Just look for the ones that are written for Xcode 8 or Swift 3. So with that in mind, what we can do is we can actually create our own Xcode project and actually get started building that iPhone app. So go ahead and click Create a New Xcode Project. You'll see that you have many different choices when you go to create a new project using Xcode. Xcode is the software you would use to create an iPhone app, a Mac app, or even an app for your Apple Watch or Apple TV. When you load it up, you should see that iOS is the first platform you can pick from, and then underneath that you'll have several choices as to what you want to develop for an application. Everything we'll be doing will be a single view application, which is a very simple project that doesn't have a lot of stuff that we need to delete later on. So starting with a single view application actually gives you a pretty good idea of what you're going to build and also how things fit together. So let's click Single View Application and click Next. Now you will need to have a few things for your new project. The first thing is to come up with a product name. So we might call this My First App. You can leave team blank for now. That only becomes important when you go to run your app on your own phone or iPad, or if you go to publish your app on the App Store. Because this app is so simple, it will actually run just fine on your computer in something called the iOS simulator that we'll discuss a little bit later on. For organization name, put in your name. This could be the name of your university, your college, your company, but it's not used anywhere in particular for what we're doing today. For organization identifier, you will want to use something unique. For instance, we might be using com.building mobile apps. You might use com.jefflinwood or whatever your name is there. Or you might use edu. The name of your college. All those things are totally appropriate. What's important is that the bundle identifier is unique for each project that you build and publish to the App Store. Under language, you may see that you have a choice of either Swift or Objective-C. Make sure that Swift is selected. Under devices, again, you have another choice between Universal, iPhone, or iPad. You'll want to select Universal because that means that the app that you build will run on both iPhones and iPads. Underneath, you'll see 3 checkboxes for using core data, including unit tests or include UI tests. Uncheck all of those if they're selected. We won't be using any of those features for our very first app. Now click Next. You'll see that you have the option of saving your project into a folder. Underneath, you will see a checkbox for source control, create Git repository on my Mac. If you're familiar with Git, go ahead and leave that checked if you want to. If you're not familiar with Git, Git is a version control system that allows software developers to maintain a history of the project that they're working with, and creating a Git repository for your project lets you collaborate with other developers on your project. It lets you save your source code, which is the actual building blocks of your application, up to a server like GitHub. It also lets you go back if you make a mistake. So let's just say that you're working on a project and you basically get to a certain point and it's working really well. Then if you commit all your changes at that point, you can always go back later to that sort of last known good version. So if you're working as a professional software developer, using source control is always something that you'll need to have as one of your skills. For what we're doing, we're just going to focus on building an iPhone app, so you can go ahead and leave that one unchecked. Click Create. Okay, now we're looking at the project. So we actually see that we have something called My First App here. We have a wide range of options that you'll see here. If your screen doesn't look exactly like mine, XCode does actually change the way that things appear. Come up and take a look at the upper right, and you'll see that on this toolbar, you can show or hide the windows to left, bottom, and right. I'm going to keep all 3 of these open where I can, and that will basically show any information in those. However, if you have a smaller screen or you just want to reclaim a little bit of space, you can certainly hide some of these as we go. Alright, so if everything works, we can just click this play button here. And what we're doing here is we're actually compiling our application, which XCode generated for us, and now we're going to run it in the iOS simulator. So you'll see here that what looked to be an iPhone running on my computer just launched. And this actually is a simulated iPhone. So instead of having to have your phone out and connected with a cable to your Mac when you build your iPhone apps, you can actually use this iPhone simulator, and that will let you run almost all of the functionality of an actual iPhone. Now, importantly, things like push notifications don't work on the iOS simulator, so you will need a real device to test that. And in addition, it is easier to test some things like the camera or the location-based functionality on an actual device. But again, for the project we're building for your very first iPhone app, the iOS simulator will work great. So don't worry about the fact that you don't have your own iPhone or you don't have your own iPad. If you're building this on a Mac, the iOS simulator will come with XCode for free. And you have quite a few choices. If you go back to the main XCode project and click iPhone 7 Plus, you may see that you have a different set of choices than I do. For instance, you may only have iPhone 6s, or you may only have the iPad Air. Feel free to change those around by adding additional simulators. In general, you won't need more than one or two of the simulators to actually do your project, but I would suggest that you keep simulators for things like the iPhone 7 Plus, the iPhone SE, which has a smaller screen, and then the iPhone 6, which is sort of in between the iPhone SE and the Plus. In addition, the iPads also give you the ability to test out how your app looks on an iPad screen. All right, so assuming this all worked, then you have a functioning app and you have an application running in the simulator. You can see that your iPhone app is blank because you haven't done anything to it yet. So let's go ahead and make some changes to that iPhone app. If we go back to the XCode project, you can see that when we created this XCode project, over on the left-hand side, and be sure to click this folder icon in the upper left-hand corner if you don't see anything there, take a look and just kind of glance through the different files here. You'll see that we have appdelegate.swift, viewcontroller.swift, main storyboard, an assets folder, launchscreen.storyboard, and info.plist. We also have a section called products, and that shows the basically compiled version of your product. Go back to main.storyboard. This is the visual representation of our iPhone app. So you can see here that, and again, if you don't see this outline here, and I'll expand this outline here so you can see what I'm talking about, you can actually show it by clicking this button here, and this will show the outline. So make sure you have this outline open, then expand it so you see that there's view controller scene, view controller, and a view. So the view controller represents one screen in your iPhone app. We have a view controller, which is the code behind the screen, and then we have the view, which contains all of the items on the screen. For instance, if we had several buttons and we had a map, that would be all things that would be on one screen that would belong underneath. For instance, if we had several buttons and then we had a map, all those things would be put onto the view, and then we could work with them from the code inside the view controller. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Let's go ahead and put a button onto the view. So come down to the lower right hand corner and make sure that you have the right hand window exposed here so you can see these different utilities. Then come down to this panel at the bottom. Yours may look like this, showing the Cocoa Touch class, UI test class. Go ahead and pick the third option here. This is the object library. This is a list of all the user interface components that you can put onto a view in the storyboard. So go ahead and find the button. Simply scroll down, you'll find button here, and then drag it onto the storyboard. You'll see that as I drag it, various guidelines appear to show that I'm centering this button in the middle of the screen. This comes in very handy because iPhones have very different sizes. So for instance, the smaller iPhone SE has a different screen size than the iPhone 7 Plus. And we can use a layout system called Auto Layout to make sure that our user interfaces are consistent across all these different devices and screen sizes. Those little guides that showed up when I dragged the button out to the view will help us later when we go to align this button directly in the middle of the screen. For now, let's just leave this button here in the middle, and we can actually change some of the properties of this button. So click the button, then click the fourth tab on the right hand side, which is the Attributes Inspector. You'll see there's several different choices for this button. Let's go ahead and change the text color. So it should be a nice blue. We can go ahead and change that to perhaps another color, and go ahead and pick Other. And then from the color wheel, for instance, maybe pick a nice red. So now we have a button with red text. Instead of just saying the word button, go ahead and select this field here and replace the title button with red. And now you can see that we have a button with red text color, and then we have the word red in it. And then let's go ahead and center this red button, so it's always going to show up in the center of the screen no matter what size iPhone we run it on. Go ahead and click the button, and again, you can select it here in the view, or you can select it in the outline. Come down and select the Alignment Constraints button. That will pop up this really nice pop-up menu that lets you pick from several different options. These are all auto layout options. What we are doing is we're adding constraints to the view. And what do I mean by constraints? Well, the way you can think about it is that you can give the iPhone app instructions as to where to put this button on the screen. For instance, we can choose to horizontally center it in its container by checking this box. And then we can also choose to vertically center it by checking this box. Now we'll have the option of adding two constraints. Click that button, and you'll see that two lines will show up representing the constraints. Now if we were to run this application again, go ahead and click stop. It may ask you, your Xcode may ask you if you want to stop, if you're sure that you want to stop the project, and that's okay. So go ahead and click play, and that will build and run your application. And now when you run this in the simulator, you'll see that you have a red button in the center. Go ahead and click that red button with your mouse. It's not going to do anything yet. We haven't added any code to do anything, but you do have an iPhone app with a red button. Well, this is pretty good, but let's actually make this button do something. So, what do we do to actually make that red button do something? Well, we will need to write a little bit of code in Swift. So, let's go ahead and use something called the XCode Assistant. Up in the upper right-hand corner of the Xcode toolbar here, you'll see that there's a button with two interlocking circles. It says Show the Assistant Editor. Click that. What you'll see is that now you have the storyboard on the left-hand side, and then you have some code on the right-hand side. And what is this code? It says it's viewcontroller.swift. Well, what does that mean? This view controller represents the code that powers this iPhone screen. So, this view controller, and it's a little confusing here because we have something called viewcontroller.swift. That is the name of the actual file on your disk. We also have something called a class view controller, and that represents the code that you can write, or you are going to write. And then we have something called UI view controller. UI view controller is Apple's base view controller class for all iPhone apps. So all iPhone apps have the same core functionality for one of these view controllers. And as a developer, you can write your own code that customizes how your screens work. So for instance, if you have an app that has a screen with a map on it and another screen that lets you record audio, those will both be different classes. For instance, they won't both be viewcontroller.swift. It might be mapviewcontroller.swift or recordAudioViewController.swift. But they'll both extend the UI viewcontroller base class that Apple provides for us. And if you're wondering where that UI viewcontroller comes from, you can see that we have this import UI kit line at the top of the viewcontroller class, and that tells Xcode that this particular source code file relies on the UI kit which is part of the base functionality built into the iOS, iPhone, and iPad operating system. Also in this project, you'll see at the very top there are comments. So comments are these lines in green. You'll see that they have 2 forward slashes, or you will also see some that have a slash and an asterisk, followed by some text, followed by an asterisk and a slash. And those are notes for the developer. So they don't do anything for the computer. They're strictly for you or for anyone that you share this code with to read. But inside of those, you'll see, for instance, at the top of these screens, who created this file, for instance, me, Jeff Linwood, what date it was created, and then a copyright. So you can see here that that's the first half of this viewController.swift. Underneath that, we have the class definition for viewController. So here we have a class called viewController, and it extends this UI viewController. So it has all the functionality that will make a screen show up on the Mac, it has all the functionality that will make the screen show up on iOS. And then we have 2 curly braces, an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace that contains 2 functions. View did load and did receive memory warning. We won't be changing the way that either one of these 2 functions work in this project, but we will be adding our own function. The function we're going to add is a special kind of function. It's called an action. An action represents some action that a user could take on user interface elements such as a button, and in particular, what would happen if they press the button. On iOS, that's called the touch up inside action. Now there's a special way that you need to create actions using this XCode assistant, and it's a little strange, but it will really help you if you practice it a few times. So go ahead and select the button over in the outline. It's a little bit trickier to select the button from the view here because you may accidentally select one of the constraints, and you don't want to select a constraint and drag an action from it. You want to make sure that you select the button, for instance the one here that says red. So hold down Control, click the button, the red button, and then drag a connection over into your viewController class. Be sure that when you drag the connection that it goes above the override func viewDidLoad line, but beneath the class viewController:UI viewController line. The reason for that is that when we add functions to our classes, they all need to be at the same level. So we don't have a function that, for instance, goes within another function. We are adding a function that goes outside the other 2 functions inside the viewController class. Once you try this out a few times, it'll seem a lot more clear. So let's show how it works. Now, if you still have the control buttons held down and you still have the outlet here, you'll see that you have an option here to insert an outlet, an action, or an outlet collection. We need to insert an action, and the way you do that is once you have that showing, simply release both the mouse button or the trackpad and the control button. You'll see that a little pop-up appears to let you create a connection. Now, very importantly, there are 2 kinds of connections to create. One is an outlet and one is an action. We are going to create an action. An action is a function that responds to an event from the user, for instance, pressing a button or moving a slider. In this particular case, what we're interested in doing is changing the behavior of something based on when someone presses the button. So what we'll do is we'll select action here, and you'll see that that changes the dialog slightly. Be sure to do this if you are putting in an action. It is very common to accidentally put in an outlet and where you meant to put in an action. So double check this as action here. You'll see that the event will be touch up inside, the type will be any, and the arguments will be sender. You can leave all those the way they are. Under name, let's call this red button pressed. And you could actually call this anything you like. Click connect. All right, we just added some code to our project. you'll see that we now have a function. It's called red button pressed. It's marked with this func func keyword to show as an action, or to show it as a function. It's marked as an interface builder action, which means that it is available to be used as an action for one of the user interface controls on the view. Now, because we use the control drag functionality from the Xcode assistant, that allows us to have this automatically connected to the button, and we can see that it is connected because there is a dot over here next to the line number. So over here, these numbers are actually the line numbers of the code, and there's a dot here, and if I hover my mouse cursor over it, you can see that it shows that the red button is selected. So that's showing there is a link, that when someone presses the red button, it will run this function. So let's go ahead and just write one line of Swift code that will run when someone presses that red button. So when Xcode creates the function here in the interface builder action, it doesn't leave you any room to write some code, so press enter after the opening curly brace. And now what we'll do is we want to make this red button do something, and what we will do is we will make the background color of the iPhone app turn red. So we'll write one line of Swift code. Start with view, V-I-E-W. Every view controller has a view that contains all of the things that you see on the storyboard. So when I type view here, that corresponds to this view in the outline. What I'd like to do is turn the background color of that view to a red color. So what we can do is we can type in view, V-I-E-W, and then type period. You'll see that one of the great features about Xcode is it has what's called auto-completion. So I highly suggest that you get comfortable using auto-completion, because you can start to filter down your options for looking for things like colors or setting fonts or anything like that by just starting to type a few letters, and you'll see that Xcode will only give you the options that contain those letters. So for instance, background color, send subview to vec, etc. If I was to type G there, it would narrow this down even further. What's great about this is that with programming, you need to be very precise, and Swift is a case-sensitive language, and so you will need to make sure that if it's expecting something called background color, that if the C is capitalized here, that you put a capitalized C in your source code. Otherwise, it won't be recognized as the same thing, and your code won't work. Matter of fact, it won't even compile, which means that Xcode will put up a complaint, it will put up a red arrow, and you won't see anything work at all. So just be aware of the fact that if you are using Xcode, this autocomplete can be your best friend. So go ahead and pick background color. And then press the space bar. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the background color. So the view represents what you can see underneath the button, so it's going to be the entire background view of the app. And we can set properties on the view. One of those properties is the background color. And if we set view.background color equal to UI color dot red, then what we'll have is we'll have a function, red button pressed, that takes the existing background color, which is white, and sets it to red when someone presses the button. So go ahead and click the play button up here to run your first app. You'll see that your app loads. It looks exactly the same as it did when we started, but if we were to press this red button, you'll see that the background goes completely red. And that's all based on the one line of Swift code that we wrote inside viewController.swift. So, just to sum up what we've done so far in this project, we've built our first iPhone app. We've run it on an iPhone 7 Plus in the iOS simulator. We've learned a little bit about putting user interface controls onto views in storyboards. We've also worked a little bit with the XCode assistant, which lets us give functionality of things like buttons in our views. And then we've written one line of Swift code that changes the background color of the view to red. Wrapping this up, we can move on to our next project, which is to have different choices for the different colors and to do some more interesting things. We'll be doing more with storyboards, with auto layouts, with actions, and with those outlets that I didn't cover in this part. We'll also be getting a little bit more into the Swift programming language, and you'll learn a little bit more about how the user interface controls in iOS work. But for your very first iPhone project, I hope you had fun building it, and I hope that this encourages you to keep learning iPhone app development. Thank you, and this is Jeff Lenwood.